Hi, I'm the Reverend Dr. John Griffiths. And look, I'm just really passionate about the Bible and passionate about getting the most out of the Bible and teaching other people how to do that as well. So in this video, I'm going to be giving you 3 interpretive keys for the Gospel of Matthew. And the way I'm approaching it is, if I was sitting next to you and we had the Gospel of Matthew open, what are the first things that I would be pointing out and showing you about the Gospel of Matthew? Well, you see, the first one is that Matthew sees Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament. So Matthew has these 10 quotations in his Gospels, and he sees Jesus as fulfilling these specific passages from the Old Testament. And the way we go about identifying them is Matthew will say something along the lines of, these events took place in order to fulfill what was spoken about in the prophet Isaiah, for example. So there's 10 of these, and 4 of them are found in the infancy narratives. But sometimes we can get a little bit sidetracked and only look for these direct quotations. What we see is that some scholars suggest that there's upwards of 60 direct quotations from the Old Testament in Matthew's Gospel. So they're not introduced with the formula, but they're still direct quotations. Now, beyond quotations, what we also see is that there are some, on top of this, some 300 literary allusions in Matthew's Gospel. So think about it this way. Matthew's Gospel is 28 chapters long, and there's 300 allusions in Matthew. That means in every chapter, there's at least 10 allusions to the Old Testament, right? So Matthew's Gospel is infused with the Old Testament, with all of these different passages and all of these different motifs from the Old Testament. And Matthew is infusing his Gospel with all of these Old Testament references in order to guide you to meditate and reflect on who Jesus is and why he came to Israel. So Matthew sees Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament. And actually the theme of fulfillment is so important in Matthew's Gospel. We see in the Sermon on the Mount, we get a little bit of a picture into what fulfillment means. Jesus says, "Don't think that I've come to abolish the law." This is in Matthew 5:17. "But rather, I have come to fulfill the law." Now, the way a lot of people understand this idea of fulfillment here is that Jesus keeps the law perfectly, so I don't need to. But this is not what Jesus is saying here. Jesus is using this idea of fulfillment as filling up. Think about a cup that's half full. Jesus says, I've come to give this cup fulfillment. I've come to bring it to its fullest understanding. I've come to fill this cup up to the top. So in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus is talking about fulfilling the Old Testament law, he's talking about outlining not just the letter of the law, but also the intention that lies behind the law. And so when we're looking at Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament, it's not about simply this one-to-one, Jesus fulfills this. It's actually about bringing the fullness of meaning to these Old Testament passages. Now, what we also see is that Matthew's central section is almost like a path of discipleship. The main middle section of the Gospel, after we've had the infancy narratives, after we've had John the Baptist and his baptism, once we see Jesus begin his ministry, there are these 5 steps that Jesus takes his disciples on. So first we see there's a focus on what Jesus said, right? This is the classic Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5:7. So there's a focus on what Jesus says, and then the second step is, well, what did Jesus do? This is Matthew 8 and 9, and we see Jesus going and casting out demons, healing many. He calls disciples. He raises a little girl back to life. So what did Jesus say? What did Jesus do? And then in Matthew 10, there is an imitation of Jesus. So it's not just what Jesus did, but then how did the disciples go out and do what Jesus did and said? So you can see there is this very logical progression that goes on in these opening chapters. So from here, then the next question is, well, how did the people respond? And what we see is that some towns reject Jesus, that the Pharisees and even his own family begin to reject Jesus. But at the same time, others respond positively. We see the feeding of the 4,000 and the feeding of the 5,000. So this is Matthew 11 to 15. There's really this evaluation of, okay, Jesus has said and done this. He sent the disciples. How did everyone respond to this? And once we have this response, then Matthew 16 to 20 really then focuses in on Jesus forming this new community. Now, this final section, Matthew 16 to 20, is Matthew's travel narrative, where Jesus begins to predict his death. He begins to teach his disciples about discipleship and give other teachings in and around here. And also in here, we see that Jesus begins to outline what it means to be the people of God, what it means to be this new community that he envisions. So we can see Matthew's central section actually has this very consistent narrative flow from what Jesus said, did, who he sent, and then how did people respond, and what is Jesus's community going to look like. Now, the third thing that I would point out, if I was sitting next to you and we had the Gospel of Matthew open, the third thing that I would point out is that Matthew's Christology, it's really unique. And it's almost like a mosaic of different Old Testament motifs. And in particular, there's 4 really important motifs that you need to be aware of. Now, the first motif that really bookends the whole of the gospel is this idea of God with us. You know, right at the beginning of the gospel, in the infancy narratives, before Jesus is even born, it says that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. That Jesus fulfills this passage from Isaiah 7. Now, what's really interesting here is that the passage in Isaiah talks about a baby that's born to a young woman or a virgin, and they're going to call this baby called Emmanuel. And Matthew says that Jesus fulfills this passage, but Jesus is called Jesus. So we're left to question, how does Jesus fulfill this passage in Isaiah about a baby who will be called Emmanuel? You see, it's forcing us beyond a literal one-to-one interpretation and actually making us contemplate this idea that Jesus is God with us. So that's at the start of the gospel. Now, at the very end of the gospel, Jesus appears to his disciples and he gives them the Great Commission and he says, "Behold, I am with you." Now you think, oh, that's a pretty innocuous little statement that Jesus says. And it seems innocuous until you realize that "Behold, I am with you" is a very particular type of statement in the Old Testament. It's a statement that only Yahweh says to particular people. He says it to Jacob. It is a promise of divine presence. So this idea that Jesus says, "Behold, I am with you," is sort of bookending this idea of Yahweh amongst us, Yahweh with us. At the start and at the end, Jesus is portrayed not only as some sort of human figure, but he's portrayed as Yahweh with us. Now, the second motif in this mosaic is the idea that Jesus is the personification of Israel. That the fate or the history of Israel, that Jesus relives it, but then Jesus also takes on the fates and the curses of Israel so that Israel might be freed. So to give you an example of this story in the infancy narratives where Jesus goes to Egypt and then comes back out of Egypt to the promised land. This is reliving the history of the people of the sons of Israel going into Egypt and then the Exodus moment, right? This whole story that happens in the infancy narratives is pointing us back to the history of Israel, going into Egypt and then coming out. And then finally, in his death, we see that Jesus takes on the curses that had led Israel into exile. And by doing this, he releases Israel and brings Israel back into a covenant of peace with God. We also see that Jesus is set up as a new Moses. So just as Jesus goes into the wilderness temptation, what's really interesting about this wilderness temptation is that he quotes from Deuteronomy, which is Moses' last speech. So there's this idea that Jesus is set up as a Moses-like figure, even from his testing in the wilderness. We see, again, his Sermon on the Mount parallels very closely with Moses in Deuteronomy in particular, where Moses hands down the law and now Jesus hands down the fullest interpretation of the law. And then finally, we also see that there's numerous parallels between Jesus and Moses in the Transfiguration. That is where Moses goes up into a mountain, sees God, and his face glows. And in a similar way, Jesus goes up a mountain and his divine presence is revealed and his face glows. So these are some of the points where we see these motifs occur. And then finally, what we see is that Jesus is presented as the righteous sufferer. And in particular, there's two passages or two collections from the Old Testament that really help us understand Jesus as the righteous sufferer. The first is the suffering servant in Isaiah. This is actually explicitly quoted in Matthew's Gospel. It's one of those 10 direct quotations which Jesus fulfills. This idea that Jesus is the suffering servant from Isaiah. Now, the second collection of writings which contain a righteous sufferer is David's Psalms of Lament. And this is in particular found in Jesus' passion narrative, his crucifixion scene. We see that Jesus quotes from Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is a quote directly from Psalm 22. And there's all this mocking and all these little allusions that go on in this passion narrative. And it's really based around the Psalms 22 and Psalms 69. So if we were together, these are the three interpretive keys that I would be pointing out to you so that you could dive deeper into these Gospels. And if you want to see my other videos on the other Gospels, I'd encourage you to go to my YouTube page and subscribe. And if you want to encourage me, look, click the like button, leave a comment, leave a question. I always love hearing from my viewers, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.